Alright, so I want to get into Talis Bloom after PP gain. Now, of course, this isn't going to be definitive until the skill comes out next week, but I wanted to have a discussion because I think it's going to have a lot of consequences, and for Wand and especially Talis users, a lot of things we're going to want to think about when it comes to using our Pre-Kvaris tokens or our tickets. If you recall, those Pre-Kvaris tickets are going to allow us to get the Evoli Eclipse weapon. Right now, the Evoli Eclipse weapon will not drop. It seems to be a very powerful, at least a very powerful starter weapon for the next region, and so we want to use those tickets wisely. I'm looking at Talis Bloom after PP gain and seriously considering that it could have some strong implications to how we want to multi-weapon as Techter in the future. So let's discuss. At the end of a Talis deployment triggered by a Talis photon art, you recover PP based on the number of times a technique was used while that photon art form was deployed. Now, of course, we don't know the numbers, but on paper, this is a great skill. Essentially, after using Talis PA techniques, you sheath the weapon and you get PP back. For those who are familiar, this is very similar to an S5 augment in PSO2 base, which was Parting Gift, where essentially after you did a certain amount of damage with your weapon, the minute you sheathed it, you would get a certain amount of PP and HP back. So essentially, Talis Bloom after PP gain gives you pretty much a similar concept. Another thing I like about this skill is that it synergizes well with Talis's multi-weapon faults. If you're not familiar with Talis and a multi-weapon, when you deploy a Talis or when you use that Talis photon art, if you were to swap to another weapon in the multi-weapon, it automatically cancels the Talis photon art. So essentially now with this skill, something that was a detriment is now a benefit. So essentially I can wand Talis multi-weapon, I can deploy the Talis, fire some shots, and then when I want to switch to wand or get some PP back, all I have to do is simply hit a normal attack button or a wand parry button, and that is going to cancel the Talis PA, giving me that PP back, activating the skill. Not only was this just an issue when it comes to multi-weapons, but when we look at Wand and we look at Talis, they're both PP hungry weapons. Now, of course, Wand being more PP hungry than Talis, just because of wave crash and the cost per PA. So in a multi-weapon, one of the issues was if you're using Wand, you're going to be burning through your PA. So even if you could switch to Talis effectively, you wouldn't have any PP to use any Talis photon arts. You'd have to do normal attacks or some other means of getting your PP back. And the same thing would go for Talis. Essentially, you're going to be firing your shots, and there really wasn't a way to regain PP other than normal attacks, your weapon action, and tricky capacitor, which depending on the situation can be very difficult to charge and thus get that PP refilled. Now, with Talis Bloom after PP gain, firing those Talis shots is going to give us back some degree of PP. So when we switch back to Wand or some other multi-weapon, we are going to actually be able to use it because we're not going to be at a PP deficit. The great thing about this synergy now is that I can cancel the Talis photon art with a Wand parry. That counter attack is already going to get me about 22 PP, in addition to the PP I'm going to get from Talis Bloom after PP gain. So there's some nice synergies built in there. Additionally, Wand, giving Wand skip arts in the fourth attack, we're probably going to have some PP management from Wand in of itself. So not only are we not burning through PP with Wand when we switch to Talis, when we go from Talis to Wand, we're also going to get PP back. So it sets a nice transition. Now, why am I interested in these skills and potentially considering multi-weaponing Wand and Talis in the next patch update versus my usual Wand and jet boots? That is because of the concept I like to discuss, which is power curves. The big issue that Techter has is DPS. And so essentially it has a lower power curve when you look across, a battle over time. We have spikes with things like your Photon Blast, with things such as Wand parry counter, and with our compound techniques. But other than that, our DPS is fairly low. Another thing that hurts Techter's DPS, specifically with Wand, is reach and accessibility. When you have Wand lovers active, that kind of goes away because we can now essentially rush to the enemy in close distance. But when we don't have that ability active, anytime an enemy escapes, we have to chase them down. So no matter what our DPS is, it's always going to be a drop. Talis, on the other hand, doesn't have that issue, though overall it has lower DPS. And if you look at the frame data, no matter what element you're using, and let's say you're going to use your single target Talis PA, it's going to be about 288 DPS, not including the Talis weapon action where you can add another 9 DPS to your total. The benefit of Talis is that A, it's ranged, so that you don't have those issues of wand where an enemy gets away, you can continue to do damage while you're closing distance. The other benefit, and I think this is really where the power of Talis comes through, is targeting a weak point. Because once again, when you hit a weak point, you are multiplying your damage by 150% or 1.5x. So instead of doing 288 DPS, ignoring the Talis weapon action, you'll be doing 432 DPS as long as you can consistently hit that enemy weak spot, which is very powerful when you think of DPS overall. If we're going to use jet boot intensity as an example, in its ideal conditions, it is about 444 DPS. So a consistent 432, not to mention I'm ignoring the 10% weapon bonus that you get from Techter, is pretty good, especially since if you can be consistent with it, you don't need the enemy to be downed while using the Talis Photon Art. The problem being, as I discussed previously, was that Wand and Talis both consume a lot of PP, and of course right now Wand without fourth attack, and of course once again this is going to come down to numbers, could not compete with the power of jet boot intensity, requiring jet boots to be a thing. But with the changes to both weapons, we might no longer have that issue. You still use Wand as your primary damage dealer, but then we have situations where we can effectively switch to Talis and have PP, have it fire at a distance or chase the target, or in situations that we'll get into in a little bit, to where the enemy's kind of moving around a lot, the camera's moving around, and your wand is not always going to hit the weak spot. You can always switch to Talis, reposition, recenter, while being more consistent and hitting the weak spot, doing more DPS. Once again, a Talis Photon Art that hits a weak spot will always be stronger than most of Wand's attacks that do not. The only thing that it cannot compete with is going to be your step counter and your wand parry counter. Let's get into some of those examples where we might see the benefits and overall power when multi-weaponing Wand and Talis with these new skills. Of course, these examples are current state, so you're not going to see the benefits, you're actually going to see the detriments of not having these skills. But to give us an idea of where swapping between Wand and Talis back and forth could be very fundamental to Techter's gameplay and giving us the DPS and, more importantly, the power curve that we need to compete with other weapons so that we're not tied down to Techter Bouncer Wand jet boots all the time. So let's start with an easy one, which is the entry point of a battle or the start of the battle, say Battle Dia, where there's always going to be a considerable distance between you and the target. Now you can burn that PP as you work your way to the enemy, knowing that once you get into wand attack range, you're going to get PP back and can continue the fight from there. Closing distance and creating counter opportunities. Closing distance is obvious. The enemy gets away from you, wand can't really do much. You want to chase the target with Talis Photon Arts. Whether or not you're hitting a weak point or if it's just a regular spot, once again, you want to close that distance and do damage because that's going to keep your DPS up. The second point is probably more impactful. As you've probably realized, the closer you get to an enemy, sometimes the less opportunities you have to counter. In this example of Fortis, because it has a lot of range capabilities, being in front of the enemy at some distance, you usually have more opportunities to counter a missile, to counter a bullet that it fires from its hand, so on and so forth. You know, if you don't want to counter, you want to stay right next to it. But when we think of wand parry counter as being one of our strongest abilities, being able to close distance while still keeping an appropriate distance gives us more opportunities to do damage, thus more DPS overall. Now, instead of trying to chase your opponent and close the distance, we can also stall. Some enemies like to run away from us, but given their patterns, we know they're coming right back. And so it's ineffective to chase, knowing that if I just hold my position, they're going to come right back to me. And this creates a great opportunity to just fire in place, waiting for that enemy to return. Wand parry counter, as you see in this example with Luzentos. Anytime they change distance, continue to fire on them. With our new skills, swapping back between Wand and Talis and being more PP efficient overall, gives us the ability to keep consistent DPS up, regardless of if the weak spot is exposed or not. Another issue that Wand has specifically is elevation and camera angles. One of the problems with Wand, especially when you get close, is that where you're hitting the enemy compared to where the camera is can be off, especially if the enemy's weak spot is above you. Luzentos is another great example, but also think of the Banshees or the Bancers, to where you're so close, even though you might be aiming for the head, which has a weak spot, you're actually hitting like the foot, or you're not hitting the exact spot, so you're not getting that damage. So the great thing of swapping the Talis allows you to do is exploit the tracking. You can reposition, you can recenter the camera, while also having a better or at least more consistent shot at hitting the weak point, so that you can get into the position to now land your stronger wand attacks, wand parry counter, so on and so forth. Repositioning and maintaining altitude. So this is really things we've already covered when we think about elevation and we think about stalling, but there are some enemies that don't really necessarily cover a lot of distance, but they do a little small micro movements like turning or shifting, or they're swinging. And especially now that you've gotten the weak spot broken, like in this example, you want to make sure that you're targeting it. Problem with Wand is when we swing, even though we can maintain altitude as we're swinging, we're stuck in that position. We really can't move unless we use Wave Crash, and even then it's a lot of PP wasted. We're likely not hitting the weak spot. So we can swap the Talis, fire our Photon Arts, turn and move to make sure that we're lined up with the weak spot, get closer to the weak spot, and then get our wand damage on. Not to mention, because of our Talis bloom after PP gain, when we swap back to wand, we've got PP back to continue the fight without needing to use our normals or something else to get our PP back. And last but not least, compound techniques. One of the issues with jet boots is that it does not build your compound technique. Now, of course, the trade-off is the damage that jet boots provide, specifically jet boot intensity, does to a degree cover that detriment. Switching between wand and Talis, all of your attacks now build that compound gauge. And similar to potency, when you attack a weak spot, the rate in which you build compound, the rate in which you build PB, down, so on and so forth, I believe they all follow the same rules, that they also get modified. And I'm not too sure about that, so I might be incorrect in saying that compound technique rate increases by hitting a weak spot. But either way, you're having more consistent streamlined compound building, which means more compound technique damage and using it more frequently. When we look at compound techniques overall, their DPS ranges from about 435 to 453. Take that, which is already higher than jet boot intensity, and of course you want to multiply it by your main class weapon, because you're going to be either triggering it through wand or Talis. You've got a lot of damage that you can consistently build up, swap between wand and Talis given that situation. The other thing that's great about this is, if we don't have to use bouncer, we can use something like fighter and the numbers make sense, then we're getting an additional 5% on top of our damage. And those are my thoughts. Wanted to get this out before the update, so we have some things to think about before we make a big decision on which Evol Eclipse weapons we're going to have. I'm hoping this works out so we can have more Techter options, such as Techter Fighter, Techter Force, and of course Techter Bouncer is still going to be there, but variety and flexibility and accessibility can be very, very powerful, and so I look forward to seeing what we get next week.